So before I get into natural selection, and David touched on a little bit of this, I'd like to explain a little bit of the motivation of why I would come up with such a point that a dynamical view of natural selection is needed to understand human creativity and human evolution, cultural evolution. And Professor Lottie already said some of it. I came from a very diverse background, which is kind of a blessing and a curse, but it has given me a very different view, I think, of certain things. And I'll just kind of go through it. I came from a musical family here in Queens, and my father was a jazz musician, jazz bass player and violinist. My mother was a chorus girl on Broadway a little bit. And I studied a little music, and one thing that struck me big about composition, musical composition, you get a point if you can tell me what this music is how rigorous it is. No, it's not just about free thinking, it's not just about ideas that pop into your head, but a deep rigor. I then, at City College, in my graduate work, I worked on a device called a fluidized bed, where you have all of these particles churning around, and it looks like a boiling bed, even though it's particles. And I studied how agglomerates come together. And what I came to was the idea that the fitness of configurations was all about resistance to forces. And then the next thing was I read Marie Curie's biography by her daughter Eve, who happened to be a pianist, and also was living on the Upper East Side at the time. I had no idea. York Avenue, she lived to 104 years old. She wrote a famous biography of her mother, Marie Curie, in 1937. It was translated in 50 languages, where she, I believe, it was the light bulb went off. The way Marie Curie discovered radium was not by guessing, not visioning. She destroyed all the other possibilities that everyone had suggested and that she could think of. She was forced to come up with the idea of another element. And of course, all the people who weren't involved had no idea. They just thought she made a mistake, and then she had to go prove it. So the idea that creativity was based on destructive forces, as counterintuitive as that might sound. I then came into contact with complex adaptive systems, which led me to the belief that this Darwinian adaptive mindset was somewhat of a universal. And then finally, I came across a psychologist and social scientist, Donald Campbell, who was put forth in the 60s and 70s a belief that learning itself, which I translate to including creativity, is a Darwinian process. And they called it evolutionary epistemology, the study of learning. And from all this, I was sure that when I went out into the world, I would see people talking about Darwinian processes in the mind to explain creativity. However, I was disabused of this notion several times when I went to the cultural evolution literature, and also when I went out into the corporate world, where they talked about creativity and strategy, which was very related. The idea of a strategy is trying to change a system, change a technology, change an organization, change a community. They saw rigor and destruction forces as the opposite of creativity, exactly the opposite. And that they would draw these pictures, okay, we have to be rigorous now and then, just kind of get our cost under control. But all the creativity is over here. That's all freedom. That's all imagination. And so I knew I had quite a challenge. So just listing 120 years of cultural evolution, and I'm sure I'm missing some, and we should add the incredible advances in computation that are coming now in these fields. And I know that they're bringing a lot of knowledge, but one thing I feel pretty confident in saying is that they don't look as the mind itself as where all the action is. It's much more, it's much more between minds, transmission. And I put in the light color here just the point that we're not only interacting with each other, but we're interacting with nature. We're interacting with all the artifacts and all the creations of human evolution and human creativity. But I struggle with this, not because I don't think transmission is really important. It's one of the things that separates human evolution from other evolution. But I was asking myself, where's the synthesis aspect of creativity? Where's the struggle? Where's the incubation? Where's the passion aspect of it? Just learning, right? Where is the struggle to create something new, to create something valid? Writing music, it's painful. It's not just sitting there and writing down a bunch of notes. It is a true struggle. And so I feel as though we need not only what happens between us and what happens between us and other objects, but we need the mind. Also, as a side note, people who consider transmission to be equivalent to heredity, I struggle with a little bit because transmission is ephemeral. And I also notice that most people reject the concept of forces. And for me, this rigor, these destructive forces that Marie Curie had were so much the key to a Darwinian process in the mind. So instead, I'm asking myself, how do we understand what's inside the mind? And following Donald Campbell's conjecture, and he called it blind variation and selective retention. So that there are variations being created in the mind, and somehow there's a mechanism of selecting, or as in Darwinian language, getting rid of the ones that don't make it. He didn't have the knowledge we have today, and I'm going to talk a little more at the end about how this is starting to come around. But first, how did this get me to natural selection? Well, I didn't see this swirling Darwinian world in the mind in the cultural evolution stuff. And when I went and looked at psychology and other programs that only look at the mind, I didn't see the true Darwinian world. So I'm out of luck. So I figured I'll go to the biology. I'll go to the biology literature, and I'll get the adaptive Darwinian processes there, and I'll drag them into a cultural understanding. And then my life got worse. So I didn't find forces in a way that made any sense to me. I didn't find fitness in a way that made sense to me, or even the definition of natural selection. And further, I learned about something called the extended evolutionary synthesis and a group called the statisticalists that were saying Darwin can't even explain a whole bunch of things, including cultural evolution. A strict Darwinian view that I was looking for. And a group called the statistics were saying natural selection isn't even a causal thing. It's a statistical outcome. So I knew I had to dig in, which led me to understanding natural selection more mechanistically in a way that it could be transferred into other domains. And that's what led me to this concept of a dynamical law, which I always thought it was in the beginning. And what I mean by a dynamical law is a law that relates change of an entity over time, depending on what's acting on it. And I'm going to talk about that now. By the way, some of you have seen the draft paper that all of this is in. Not all the story about Marie Curie and all that, but the technical discussion here is in detail. And at this moment, I'd like to thank Professor Lottie for being an advisor to me in this. And I know it's a cliche, I'm going to say it anyway. If you see goofy things up here, it's not on him, it's on me. Okay. If you go into the biological literature as an outsider, you are met with a bewildering array of definitions of natural selection. I forget this doesn't work. And I summarized a few here. This is just all the ones I captured from 1984, and I'll be talking more about 1984 in a second. Forces, causes, process. Even one textbook just said it was a correlation. Various ways of describing it as an outcome. and then those statisticalists again. It's just a statistical result. But let me bring your attention to this bottom one. Elliot Sober in 1984 wrote a very influential book called Nature of Selection. And he said natural selection is a force similar to other forces like drift and mutation and migration and non-random mating and maybe one or two others. And it's a force that can propel a population through a sequence of frequencies. And he did this, which was right up my alley, by making an analogy with Newtonian physics. And he said there's forces in physics, there's forces in biology, we can make this comparison. So it turns out that a lot of the definitions that came after and the debate that came after was based on people either trying to agree with Sober's conjecture that it was a force or disagree with it and say it's not a force at all. And that's where the statisticalists came in. They said they rightly showed natural selection's not a force, but then they said, well, there's no forces, there's nothing, it's just a result. So what was the argument? In physics, we all know, we learned it in first year physics, if you want to change the velocity of a body with mass m, you want to accelerate it to a final velocity, you have to exert a force. And this is famously known, well, here's the equation, right? Differential equation, a dynamical equation. The change in velocity with time is the acceleration equal to the force over the mass. And everybody knows what this is, right? Newton's second law of motion. Now you might ask, hey, where is F equals ma? How come you're writing it as A equals F over m, right? Just rearranged, A equals F over m. This is the wrong way to write it because it's acceleration that's the independent variable. We forget it's a dynamical equation. This is used in elementary physics where the force is just given to you and you don't have to think about it. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in a sec. Okay, so Sober said, why can't we do the same thing in biology? If we have a force acting on a population, it will change that population. And the population can change either due to death or plasticity or inability to reproduce, whatever it is. And he said, the force is natural selection. He didn't have an analogy for mass. And then he said the law is population genetics. And this is where it went wrong. I argue that the law is natural selection, that the forces are the stressors of the environment acting on the individuals in the population. And these stressors can be abiotic or they can be biotic. They can be pure abiotic things like temperature change, humidity change, salinity. They can be biotic action of predators, action of competitors. They can be agents of disease. Of course, there's a huge number of things that influence populations, and we're all familiar with those. But instead of calling them natural selection, here they are the actual forces. And the word stressor is very similar to force. It means a force, an interaction. A force is an interaction that creates a change in the target. And a stressor is a term, and there's a reason to use it, is because what stressors do is create internal forces in organisms. Internal forces lead to changes in phenotype and inability to live or inability to reproduce if they're extreme. So then what's the equivalent to mass? And this is, no question, the trickiest part of all this. Mass is the fitness of individuals, not mass. The equivalence to mass is the fitness of the individuals to the forces, the resistance to the forces. So a bacteria that is resistant to the force of antibiotics has extremely high fitness to that biotic. One that doesn't has very low fitness. And what's more important is that they're also instantaneous fitnesses. This whole thing now, the law of natural selection that relates force and fitness to change, can be written in a equation analogous to Newton's law of motion. And that is the change in the population with time is equal to the forces acting on it divided by the resistance of those forces. Please.
Could that also be analogous to Ohm's law?
You know, wait one slide and you're going to see how much of a hero you are. Okay. These are dynamical laws. They're instantaneous laws at a moment of time. If you want to get a longer time, you have to integrate. We're going to look at that in a minute. But just see the general form of this equation of natural selection. If stresses are extremely high, we expect a big change in the population. If resistance to those stressors is extremely high, we don't. So the crisis, coming up on the train yesterday, I saw an article in The Economist, I think, claiming, a doctor claiming that it is resistance, superbugs, antibacterial resistance that will be worse than cancer in short time. That's enormous resistance to the stressor of an antibiotic that's trying to break the cell wall. Of an antibiotic that's trying to break the cell wall, for example. Okay. These are all in the form of dynamical equations that in general relate three factors. A change in time, usually given by a differential, a driving force that tries to change the target system, whatever it is, and a resistance to that change. If there's no resistance, there would be infinite change, which of course is completely counter to our knowledge. Ohm's law, if you want to change the movement of electrons of charge, Q, you have to exert a voltage, sometimes called electrical pressure, just like Sober sometimes calls the force in Darwinian systems selection pressure. This is called voltage or electrical pressure. They actually call the resistance, right? R. And we know the other two. There's many of these equations. When you go to engineering school, you learn a bunch because it's all about how fast things change. Fick's law of diffusion, Fourier's law of thermal conductivity. You may come into contact these a little bit in your careers. So the structural error was that natural selection is not analogous to a force. Natural selection is analogous to a dynamical law that relates force to change as mediated by resistance, by fitness. And so now we have an analogy to all dimensions of the dynamic law of Newton. Clarity. I'm only talking about within a generation. None of this has to do with heritable variation. If you want evolution by natural selection, of course, we need heritable variation in multiple generations. I'm only talking about what goes on within a generation in the lifetime of an individual. Okay, I'm going to anticipate an objection here. How can there be forces and laws in biology like there are in physics? Just doesn't make any sense, right? And I see this all the time. One is if you go through, and this is put out in detail in that paper, if you look at the characteristics that make a Newtonian force or an electrical force what it is, the many ranges of character of Newtonian forces, right? Magnitude, direction, you can sum them, subtract them, you can describe them independent of the target, which is one thing that I never understood about natural selection, defined it as a force. What's it acting on if it's a force? Well, they would say the population, but not true. We can distinguish constraint and driving forces. I'll talk a little more about that. If you go through biological forces like abiotic forces like temperature and salinity and antibiotics and all that, you find you can see these characteristics. But even more important is the distinction between ideal physics, as you learn in textbooks, elementary textbooks, and real physics. And all those papers that were debating the force, whether natural selection is a force or not, They all hold up gravity, Newton's law of gravity, as the pinnacle of perfection and repeatability, and everybody knows it. What is the law of gravity? 2 points in space, the only feature of them is they have a mass and they attract each other by the inverse square rule, right? That's the whole gravity story. They say biology could never be anything like that. Add one more particle and you get the famous three-body. I hear it's like a sitcom now or something, the three-body problem. I thought I might have heard something. Add one more body and all of a sudden, not only can't you solve it, it's a chaotic, non-repeating solution. Path dependency. Many chemical reactions, if they don't get started up in a certain pathway, they never get to where you need them to go. Complex nonlinear systems. You wouldn't believe it, but even water flow in a pipe can't be modeled analytically. Turbulent flow. After all these years of studying water in a pipe, we can't do it. There are fundamentally very complicated things. And so keep this in your mind whenever somebody says biology can't be like physics, that no engineer ever used Newton's law directly to engineer anything. It's too complicated in the real world. Materials are too complicated. Structures are too complicated. They use coefficients that often look like selection coefficients in biology, where you have a coefficient to decide how the force is going to act. I'll sum this up. Biologists should stop holding physics to a lower standard than they hold themselves. Okay, such a dynamical law obviously has some heavy implications and requirements, and I'm just going to scan a few and get to the one that I think is really key. There are, I believe, true forces. By the way, competition is not required. Many forces that have nothing to do with competition at all. It's an organism view, not a gene view and not a trait view. I'm going to go out here and say there's no such thing as a trait having fitness. They can impart fitness, but they cannot have fitness on their own. Development and plasticity are much more inherent of a dynamical view, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I said this before, we have to distinguish external stresses and internal forces for the next one, which is now that we have an equation where force can vary from low to high, it turns out we can see how drift is actually a limiting case, a special case of natural selection when the internal forces in individuals go to zero. And it is not I do not believe it to be an independent phenomena because of this. Extinctions on the infinite side are effectively infinite. If there's an antibiotic that kills every bug in a population, that's effectively an infinite force. But I think there's one more. The one that by far I think is the biggest challenge is this concept that fitness is an instantaneous resistance. And what follows from this is the fitness we're used to seeing, small omega, and that is debated dramatically. There is no universal definition of this generational fitness, and I want to talk about that for a minute. Please.
Impedance.
Momentary.
Impedance.
Well, you mean the instantaneous fitness? Yeah, momentary, right? And an instant in time, and it can change. Whereas this concept, and we're going to talk about this for a minute, and we'll look at a picture, a generational fitness, assigning one number to your entire lifetime as the definition of your fitness, is a very long scale thing, right? And I'll get into it, and please come back with that if I don't get it. If you go to the biological literature as an outsider, you may be even more bewildered by the number of definitions of fitness. And they are all this generational fitness concept. And I summarized here, again, outcomes. You cannot define the elements of a dynamical equation with outcomes. They have to be the properties of the entities in the system. Probably one of the most famous, besides number of offspring, however you might define that, or survival, is this propensity concept, but I've got a lot of issues with that as well. So how do we get into this mess around so many definitions of fitness and so much debate in reviews and in the literature? We have to go back to the fact that these are, in fact, differential equations, not F equals ma. And let's do it in physics first. If we want to, and I'm going to add a new force, the difference between real physics and ideal physics is often the constraint forces are very complicated. Think friction, think drag force on an object going through a fluid, air, or a liquid. And these forces act opposite to constraint forces. Driving forces create constraint forces, essentially. These forces don't exist unless you've got a driving force, which I think is very interesting for some of the extended evolutionary issues around constraints, but that's another discussion. So how do you figure out a complicated situation? How would you integrate this? Well, dv, we integrate, we get delta v, right, from an initial to a final. Mass is a constant in Newtonian physics, so we can take that out. And that leaves us with integrating the driving force and the constraint force. Now, this is why where F equals ma is, these forces are either ignored, like the constraint force, or the force is a constant, or a very simple function like a sine curve, a harmonic function. And you can integrate it trivially, and so you get force equals ma. But in the real world, it's just an integral that you would have to solve if these were complicated functions. So let's do the biology side. How do we integrate the law of natural selection? Change in population. By the way, I didn't mention it. I want to correct it right now. P is actually a string of as many phenotypes as you need to characterize with different fitnesses, which is also a string that corresponds to the number of phenotypes that you need to look at. And yes, I'm assuming phenotype determines fitness. Phenotype at a moment in time, instantaneous. So how do we integrate this equation? Go back to our picture. We're going to exert a force, and we have the fitnesses in there. Well, the change in population, delta P, that's easy, right? I didn't show it here, but it's trivial. And then we have to integrate the force over the instantaneous fitness. And this is where Newton and Darwin diverge. This is an extremely difficult integration. So to explain it, we've got to zoom in within a generation. We can't just look at generations one at a time. And what this picture is, imagine an organism that has development in a womb or in an egg, and that's their internal environment, and then living in the external environment, and then starting again. So this is the beginning of generation 2. And this circles, all they are is to figuratively represent an individual developing over time, and then reproducing, and then post-reproduction. And I know that's very rare, but just for completeness. So just imagine if you took this, you would see, if you looked at it over generations, right, you would see this repeated over and over and over again. Here's one of the big problems. Fitness changes with development. The fitness of a developing organism in an egg may be much different than that same individual's fitness early in development, once hatched, and maybe much different fitness at reproduction. Here's two different fitness profiles. We call them fitness profiles or fitness functions. And different organisms can have completely different profiles. Like this one, this blue one, and these are just made up, could suggest an organism where there's a huge number of young, right, a fish or turtles or whatever, and the chances of being eaten are very high. And fitness goes very low right after hatching. So if we're going to, yes, please.
With that parentheses, omega of
Thank you.
SDR, are you implying that omega is a function of the...
Absolutely. So I put it here. The internal and external environment exert stressors on the growing individual, or even in the earliest development, right? The nucleus has all of these tests to determine whether the developing embryo or developing fetus should be continued. And if they find problems, they either try to repair it, right? There's this huge number of mechanisms to repair bad gene sequences, or abort. And that's due to those are the stressors of the internal environment. And there may be others as well that deform growth. And then the external environment can be any. So fitness is a function of the stressors, right?
That makes complete sense to me. I'll point this out, maybe come back to it later. In physics, mass is not a function of the forces on it. It's very different.
I'm glad you raised that, so I get to explain that there are physical systems where the resistance is a function of the force. And anybody ever made it cornstarch in water?
Oh, yeah.
What happens when you put cornstarch in water and press on it hard? It actually gets harder to press. And you wouldn't see this in a physics view as much as an engineering view. These are called, as luck would have it, non-Newtonian fluids. They are fluids that their rheology, how they react, their resistance to flow, depends on the applied force. And then there's ones that are called shear thinning. When you put a force, they actually go faster. For example, ketchup. If you pour out ketchup, you see that it starts to go faster as there's fewer forces acting on it. So yes, they are special cases and not as common as mass as not a function of force. But I got this question asked by Peter in Czechoslovakia, and I had to come up with these non-Newtonian forces. So there are cases. Thank you for that. Okay, so what's the tricky part? To integrate this equation to get a generational concept of what's going to be the change from time 1 to time 2, or time initial to time final, you have to know the stressors and the instantaneous fitness function as a function of time. You could convert it to a function of development, perhaps, or there's different ways you can do it, but it's going to be, how do you integrate this mess? And here's where biology, I'll say this is where they really diverge. The problem with the fitness is it's not cumulative. So forces, if you throw a ball up in the air and then hit it with additional forces, it doesn't matter when you exert those forces. The forces are cumulative. Even the resistance forces are cumulative. Doesn't matter when you do it. But fitness is not true. No matter how fit you are, up to the point of reproducing, and if you can't reproduce, all that fitness that came before is for naught. There's no cumulative nature of fitness. And this makes it truly unique to a Newtonian system where you can add up forces and add up resistances easily. So what do we do? And what has the biological world done? They said, well, kind of screw it. We will just measure it. And so what they do is they say, this organism, which might live 50 years, in how many different environments, they'll just measure a number and say, well, number of offspring or survival rate, and it's a number, omega, that is always then converted into a relative fitness, making even it less mathematical in a sense. Or should we say, even further removed from what's actually going on in development and what's happening between environment and individual. And what this has led to, oh, by the way, this is great for practical purposes. Biological practice lives on it, right? Just as engineers don't go back to the basic equations and differential equations every time they want to design a part for a bridge, they go here from the empirical measurements. The problem is it's wrong, and it leads us to a very bad understanding of the theory. And so another objection that really gets into this is, so here's the famous price equation. And then here's an equation you probably all see. I don't know if I got the capitals right, I'm sorry. Change in population from one generation to another. If you have a selection coefficient, 1 minus the fitness coefficient, and an average fitness coefficient, you can calculate the population. In the price equation, it does all the complicated math to tell you what the next generation is going to look like if you give it those empirical coefficients for fitness. But what's the problem with this? These are what are called kinematic equations versus dynamical equations. A kinematic equation is an equation where you don't care or don't even know how the acceleration occurred or how the fitness occurred. It is simply a material balance more than anything else, where you give it the answer. Sober rightly said these numbers might have come out of the sky. They had nothing to do with the equations. And this is true in Newton's too. This equation is Newton's law that we were looking at. If you give somebody the acceleration, here, if a body's accelerating x meters squared per whatever, I can tell you what the final velocity will be after a certain amount of time. This was a kinematic equation that, though they wouldn't have written it before Newton, they kind of knew it. Galileo knew kind of what was going on with the acceleration. They were getting very close to this. These are kinematic equations. They don't describe anything around how the environment interacts with individuals. And the reason this is important is going to come back to cultural evolution, believe it or not. I'm going to talk here just a chart about the evolution of evolution. I coined that this morning. I thought it was pretty clever. So Darwin and Wallace, 165 years ago, or 100, what is it now? 165? Natural selection. And then, something not remembered too often, a term called neo-Darwinism was created in 1895. And it was created specifically to reflect a Darwinian view of evolution without Lamarckism, without inherited characteristics. What happened then is Mendel had been working in genetics. Probably I should put this a little further back, right? And that genetics were discovered, the chemistry of genetics, and it was turned into the modern synthesis, which has been now called the standard evolutionary theory, the gene-centered theory of evolution, which I find remarkable considering that Darwin didn't know a bloody thing about genes, and that neo-Darwinism didn't know anything about genes either, yet they adopted. Then in the second half of last century, and I'm very broad terms here, right? There were many either discoveries or rediscoveries of things that seemed to broaden the view of what evolution could be. You know, this is where drift became a big thing, mass extinctions, evo-devo, the importance of constraints, the importance of development, and other things, niche construction. And what happened was various people, including the extended evolutionary synthesis and these statisticalists that I talked about, said, hey, wait a minute. We can't see all this new stuff in the standard evolutionary theory. And they literally call it neo-Darwinism. But neo-Darwinism had nothing to do with genes. And so what's really going on here is that they are taking a special case of general dynamical Darwinism and calling it the general case. And they are right. You don't see all this stuff when you start with Price's equation, where someone just gave you the fitness, and you don't have to know anything about the relationship between force external forces and the individual, or development, or plasticity. You just put it all into a number. And my argument is, the problem is, to be very clear, I'm not arguing at all with the importance of the phenomena that they are saying exist, like drift and evo-devo and niche construction. And I'm saying they are mischaracterizing it as not Darwinian. They're taking a special case and turning it into the general case. And this is especially important for me because they lump cultural evolution in there with that too. And right from the beginning, my point was, I see this Darwinian world in the mind. So my argument is, let's get back to what Darwin originally articulated, and neo-Darwinism, and develop a dynamical view that brings the organism back in, and the relationship between forces and development and plasticity. And I believe that what is currently viewed as outside the Darwinian paradigm today can be brought back into it. Very briefly, I mentioned before, I see drift as a special case of natural selection, and many things I believe will become special cases of natural selection. Here I compare evolution and mechanics again, and there's the whole concept of limiting cases, right? The limiting case of Newton's second law, when force goes to zero, is Newton's first law. He wrote them backwards, right? Newton's first law. And then there's statics. And I have a feeling Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium might be related to statics. And then you have the kinematic versions that are not part of the general law in both mechanics and biology. Okay. We're close to the end. How am I doing on time? I have a few more minutes. What if you even believe me that natural selection is a dynamical law that relates external forces acting on individuals as mediated by fitness, instantaneous fitness? How does that relate to human creativity in the mind? Or maybe better said, how can we see that same thing in the mind? And then we come back to Donald Campbell. He couldn't have known all the brain science that's happening now. And the brain science is pretty interesting and pretty relevant to this. I'm going to let you read this. I know it's a little bit of a light example, but I believe you see the Darwinian system here. Tweaking, asking the question, what's fit enough to make it? Happy with it. Happy with it implies an environmental stressor that determines what's right or wrong. Finally, you output it as your memory. Then here's the punchline. This is the key. Our memory, our mind is not a filing system. It just doesn't go in. It's a reconstruction system that sounds an awful lot to me like recombination in genetics. We keep fragments in our heads and we reconstruct them, but it's not even a deterministic process of saying, I have all these fragments in my head and when I need them, I know how to combine them. There's a judgment that goes into it. And I'll just flash some of the things you see in papers. False memories. A lot of this, interestingly enough, came from false memories in court cases where they couldn't understand how people with no bad intent could not correctly recall what they had experienced it. So if it's a file system, how come? Well, it's because we're reconstructing them in a way we want them to be. The constructive mind, memory reactivation. Andy Clark, he claims that as much information from the brain goes outward in the process of vision as that comes in. And it's because we create models of what we expect to see, and it's a constant back and forth. And then there's the argument that actually these false memories, these failures, the recombinations are not spandrels. They are not an outcome that we didn't want and we're stuck with them, but that actually they may have adaptive purpose. And now I'm thinking variations allow for adaptivity. Without variation, Fisher's law, right? Without variation, there can be no adaptation. And you see them now starting to go after creative problem solving with more false memories, actually improving it. I see Marie Curie in this. I see that she had so many ideas swirling around in her head. Everybody on the outside told her she was wrong. A woman, a Polish woman no less, turn of the century, right, in Paris, and all the established men in the schools, you know, she just must have made a mistake. She just must have been wrong. But she refused to believe something that her reconstructions were telling her were false. And so she had the great conviction to go ahead and do the 4 years of ridiculous work to isolate, what, 1/10 of a gram of radium. I'll connect this to my strategy work. Just think of these as images that relate to the methods that I teach. What is the most important part of the strategy work? It's for people to internalize what's going on so that it starts this swirling process in the mind, so they start to get creative. It's actually very rigorous, not just let's go have a retreat and imagine what the future might be. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the dynamical view of natural selection would allow us to create much more, I've obviously implied it in culture, much more rigorous views of Darwinian processes in other domains, including physiochemical and in computation. And then in the red, it's those domains that are a mix of both of two of the absolute domains. All right, that's my wrap. I did want to list a few people who have read way earlier or recently and thank them very much for their feedback.